Hello, everybody. Here we are again for another fantastic lecture, if I do say so myself. And of course, I do. Today, in this lecture, we are going to look at the Industrial Revolution. Now, when speaking about an industrial revolution, we really have to understand that this also implies developments in agriculture. And this would include specifically the increase in cotton production, and more specifically, the development of the technology, the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, and we'll be talking about that as well. But in order just to give us a broad sense, we're going to refer to this as the Industrial Revolution. During this time, a wealth of new technologies are going to be developed. There will be new forms of business organization. The market revolution will occur, and the United States will generally grow economically. Okay? According to America, a narrative history, it says this: the Jacksonian era political debate between democratic ideals and elitist traditions was rooted in a profound transformation of American social and economic life. Between 1815 and 1850, the United States became a transcontinental power, expanding all the way to the Pacific coast. And geographically, this is because, of course, the Mexican-American War. It says, an industrial revolution in the Northeast began to reshape the region's economy and propel an unrelenting process of urbanization. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar with what urbanization is or what urban sprawl is, I've used that term a couple of times. It simply means the development and growth of cities. Okay, whereby something like suburbanization would refer to the development of suburban towns outside of cities. Okay, this book goes on to state, in the West, commercial agriculture began to emerge, focused on the surplus production of corn, wheat, and cattle. In the South, cotton became king, and its reign required the expanding institution of slavery. At the same time, innovations in transportation, large horse-drawn wagons called constagas, canals, steamboats, and of course the railroad knit together an expanding national market for goods and services. In sum, the 18th century economy, based primarily upon small-scale farming and local commerce, was maturing rapidly into a far-flung capitalist marketplace entwined with world markets. And that's what we're going to be looking at here. Hopefully not too in-depth, but in-depth enough to get a sense of what's going on in this lecture. So, with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, it says the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy took more than a century in the United States, but that long development entered its first phase from the 1790s through the 1830s. Now, the reason why I say the first phase is because the Industrial Revolution doesn't really stop. It just matures. It changes. And indeed, some historians refer to this early Industrial Revolution as the first Industrial Revolution, and they would refer to a second Industrial Revolution after the Civil War concluded. Okay? But it is a long process. Whereby the United States goes from being largely agricultural to largely manufacturing, mercantile capitalist sort of system. Okay, it goes on to state that the Industrial Revolution had actually begun in Britain during the mid-18th century, but the American colonies lagged far behind the mother country, in part because the abundance of land and scarcity of labor in the New World reduced interest in expensive investments in machine production. In other words, the factors simply weren't ripe for an industrial revolution to develop in the United States or the colonies at the time that the British began to develop industrially. Indeed, the factors of production were far more prevalent and readily available in Britain at the time, and that's why they sort of were the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, much of what the United States and other nations will do after the fact in their own industrial revolutions is they improved upon things that the British had already begun. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't, unique innovation going on. It's just that the British sort of laid the foundation for an industrial revolution. It goes on here to say that nevertheless, with the shift from handmade to machine-made products, a new era of human experience began where increased productivity created a much higher standard of living than had ever been known before. One thing I want to point out here is that this shift from handmade to machine-made products is really what marks an industrial revolution. Okay, you're creating more standardized commodities. You are no longer relying upon skilled labor, but rather semi-skilled labor. And indeed, the Industrial Revolution is going to bring a number of immigrants into the United States, both during its early phases and in its latter phases, because you don't need skilled labor to run a machine. The machine does most of the work. All you need is semi-skilled or low-skilled workers, and that's what you're going to get with a lot of the immigrants who come to fill those employment opportunities. So let's move on to the next slide, and we'll just dive into this a little bit more. Okay, so where does the Industrial Revolution, or when rather, does the Industrial Revolution begin in the United States? Unlike, say, the start of World War II, where we could say, December 7th, 1941, right? This marks America's entry into World War II. Trying to pinpoint a start date for the Industrial Revolution in the United States is a bit complicated, because it wasn't as if someone did something and all of a sudden everyone recognized that as the genesis of the Industrial Revolution. But if we have to pinpoint a time, I think the best place to start would be to go back on the timeline a bit to 1790 and look at Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater opened the first industrial mill in the United States in 1790, and he actually borrowed his design from the British. Now, this first industrial mill is not necessarily revolutionizing business methodologies or business organization. It's not changing the way in which labor effectively functions. We're not looking at a highly efficient system here. And indeed, the modes of production are probably still very much owned by those who produce the commodity as opposed to by some factory. Okay, but it gets the ball rolling. Okay, it says here that Slater's pirated technology greatly increased the speed with which cotton thread could be spun into yarn. Now, one of the things I do need to point out to you is that I have mentioned in the past that the economy in the United States should not necessarily be looked at as two separate economies. It's not as if there was an economy in the North and an economy in the South. The two were very much intertwined with one another. And one way that it was is that you had Southerners who grew and picked cotton, but they didn't do anything with the raw product that they created or that they had grown. Rather, they would send that raw product north into northern factories, and those northern factories would then transform that raw material into a finished product. And over time, that whole process would eventually be done in one single factory. Okay, but we must recognize that the North, including these northern factories, were dependent upon slave labor. Had the slaves not been picking the cotton, then those northern factories would not have received the raw material that they then used. Okay, northern banks who gave loans to southern farmers were reliant upon slavery. Right, northern shippers who were reliant upon finished product were reliant upon slave labor. So, it's something we have to keep in mind. Okay, but I digress. Going on, it says, while Slater, introduced a vital new technology to the United States, the economic takeoff of the Industrial Revolution required several other elements before it could transform American life. So again, Samuel Slater is sort of the start, but he doesn't necessarily alter the state of the American economy in 1790. As it says here, there's other elements that have to be in place, and so that's what I want to talk about now. Okay, so in addition to, say, mills and what will eventually become the factory system, and we'll talk more about that, but in addition to that, another key to the rapidly changing economy of the early Industrial Revolution were new organizational strategies. And the reason for that is because in an industrial revolution, you're looking for efficiency. You're looking for increased productivity. That's the whole point of a machine. The machine can be more productive than, say, a human being, right? It can be more standardized. It doesn't have to be fed. And unless it breaks down, it pretty much just works. Now, granted, early machines didn't function on their own. You needed semi-skilled, low-skilled employees, laborers, to run those machines, unlike today where you just flip a switch and the machine runs itself. But the point of it is that if you're going to have an industrial revolution, you cannot work with an outdated organizational system. Okay? Now, initially, the Industrial Revolution began with a system known as the outwork system. And the outwork system was a process where a portion of the work on any particular commodity would be done in one place, and then when that portion was completed, it would be sent off to another place. And you could have 4 or 5 different locations that was trying to make one particular commodity. Okay, so it says the outwork system, whereby small parts of a larger production process were carried out in numerous individual homes. Okay, well, that system works pretty well if you do not have machines that can do some of the work for you. In fact, this outwork system works well because you have skilled laborers who know how to do a particular part of a job, right? But as time goes on, new technologies will replace the need for skilled labor and therefore makes the outwork system outdated. Okay? And so you're going to need a new organizational system. And for the Industrial Revolution, that organizational system was called the factory system. The factory system was a process where work was performed on a large scale in one single location, what we would now refer to as a factory. And eventually, these factories will have all the machines that would be needed in order to turn cotton from its raw material into a finished product. And that would all be done in one factory, all by machines that semi and low-skilled laborers would run. This was far more productive. And so where Samuel Slater introduces a new technology and a new type of mill, it is the factory system that in many ways revolutionizes what will become the market revolution, because it allows for these commodities to be made more efficiently, and the mode of production is going to also change in this process, because the laborer who in the outwork system may have owned his tools, may have worked out of his own home, the modes of production or the means of production will not be owned by the laborer anymore. Okay? Think of it in this terms. Today, if you were to have a business where you were self-employed, you owned the building, you owned all the tools, then you would own the means of production. But let's say you work at Carl's Jr. You as a laborer do not own the means of production. Rather, you use what the employer gives you, and therefore you have a lot less control over your own work. Okay? And that's one of the changes that's going to happen with this Industrial Revolution, is the entire process of work and labor itself will shift once we move from a type of economy where the people, the laborers, the skilled laborers themselves owned the means of production, to a more factory-style system where the means of production was owned by he who owned the factory. Okay? So, hopefully that didn't confuse you, but if it did, let me know. I'll try and clarify. Just send me an email. Otherwise, let's move on. Okay, so this new organizational strategy is going to be called the factory system, as already mentioned. And one of the earliest innovators of this particular organizational structure was a group of entrepreneurs, businessmen, known as the Boston Associates. And one particular individual who you'll want to be aware of, his name is Francis Cabot Lowell. And Lowell establishes a factory in what is now Lowell, Massachusetts, under the Boston Associates. And his particular factory is incredibly important and revolutionary because his factory was the very first factory to be fully mechanized. And what that means is that Lowell's factory that he built in now Lowell, Massachusetts, was the very first factory of its kind in the United States to be able to transform cotton from its raw material to a completed commodity, what we would call the textile industry, with the help of machines at every stage of the way. Now again, these are not machines that are running themselves, completely making the worker obsolete. These machines have to be run by people, and largely for Lowell's factory, he actually ended up hiring women who became known as Lowell girls, or mill girls. And this is what America, A Narrative History has to say. They write, "The factory system sprang full-blown upon the American scene at Waltham, Massachusetts in 1813, in the plant of the Boston Manufacturing Company, formed by the Boston Associates, one of whom was Francis Cabot Lowell. Their plant was the first factory in which the process of spinning and weaving by power machinery were brought together under one roof, with every process mechanized from the production of the raw material to that of the finished cloth. In 1822, the Boston Associates developed a new water-powered center at a village along the Merrimack River, which they then renamed Lowell. And so the factory system really begins to develop under the Boston Associates, and specifically under Francis Cabot Lowell. So what Slater began in 1790 ultimately develops and grows into something much bigger under Lowell and his factory here. And again, the commodity that they are focusing on is textiles. And that's why these factories are going to be dependent upon the Southern slave system, because they need the cotton. Northerners simply could not grow cotton. In fact, much of the reason why they industrialized even early on and had a more diverse culture and economy, rather, is because the soil simply was unsuitable for them to engage in large-scale agriculture, so they didn't do it. Unlike the South, where the soil was suitable for that type of work, and so they did that thing. But in order for the factories to work, you're going to need that type of cotton, okay, from the South. And unfortunately, as it was, the South relied upon the slave system in order to make that function. So, chase down a rabbit hole a little bit there, that's okay. Let's keep moving on. As alluded to before, it says the use of female factory workers brought advantages to both employer and employee. It says the Boston Associates preferred female labor because they paid the young girls less than they did men. Now, many women who came to the Lowell factory to work were young. They tended to be single. And they were single because, of course, as a married woman, if you were to be taken out of the home to work in a factory, you would have been seen and regarded as not doing your womanly duty of raising the family and home. But these young women, many of whom would have worked on small farms, okay, now I mentioned that the North was not suitable for farming. I mean large-scale production farming. Yeah, there were a lot of farms, but they would have been personal farms, consumption-based farming, as opposed to farming being done for the purposes of selling it on the market. And so many young women who had tired of this sort of farm life thought that, hey, this is a good opportunity. Now, does this mean that the social perception of women radically changed when these women began to work in this factory for a wage, by the way? No, it did not. Women were still regarded as the inferior sex. They were still understood as being socially inferior and civically inferior. And even the labor that many of these women engaged in, the money that they would acquire would oftentimes be sent back to the head of household, which would have been their father or other male leader of the home, quote unquote, right? But this is a first step in the right direction towards helping women gain a sense of equality in the workplace. Now, these young women who ended up at the factory, they would have been understood as engaging in labor and as having been part of a market process. Women who did not gain money or did not earn a wage for their labor were not regarded by the United States as having actually labored. So if you were a housewife and a mother, you would have worked all day, every day, tirelessly, backbreakingly, but yet you would not have been considered as laboring. Although the women themselves, when you read their diaries and what have you, they very much considered themselves as having labored. Okay, it says these female workers, often called Lowell girls, benefited by experiencing a new kind of independence outside the traditional male-dominated family farm. Now, to be sure, there was a lot of oversight on these women. They couldn't just run willy-nilly as they desired. There was a lot of control that these women were under. But they were also granted an education. They had an opportunity to get to know other women and develop friendships. And generally, they had a sense of independence that was not going to be had on the family farm. Heading back to American narrative history, it says, moreover, by the 1820s, there was a surplus of women in the area because so many men had migrated west in search of cheap land and new economic opportunity. In the early 1820s, a steady stream of single women began flocking toward Lowell. To reassure worried parents, the mill owners promised to provide the Lowell girls with tolerable work, prepared meals, of which they got 2 a day, comfortable boarding houses, moral discipline, and educational and cultural opportunities. And indeed, they did. Now, I find the Lowell Mill Girls to be incredibly interesting. Indeed, I find women's history as a subject of inquiry to be incredibly interesting. One thing that I would like for you to do is, before you move on to the next slide, click where it says Tyndall 467. It's going to give you a brief overview of these Mill Girls and give you a little bit more information on who they were, how they lived, and what they did. So click on that, take a look at that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, so one thing that you're going to need in order for this industrial revolution to occur is a new system of organization. And we just looked at what that would have been. That would have been the factory system, as we saw with Lowell's factory. But in addition to that, you're going to need a couple of other things as well. Okay? It says here that dramatically increased production, like that in the New England's textile mills, were key parts of the Industrial Revolution, but required at least 2 more elements for widespread impact, right? In other words, you're going to need more than just a new organizational system, right? You're going to need a couple of other things as well. For example, 1, you're going to need an expanded system of credit. Okay, banking institutions are going to have to develop. Why? Because in order to make a factory system work, in order to be more productive, in order to increase the market revolution, you're going to have capital. And oftentimes, if you don't have working capital, you're going to have to work with loans. And so banking systems are going to develop largely in the North. Now, again, I want to stress this. Northern banks developed, and in order to feed the northern factories with the cotton, northern banks are going to offer loans to southern plantation owners who oftentimes had slaves. So again, here's another connection. But an expanded system of credit was necessary to help entrepreneurs secure the capital that they needed for large-scale and risky new ventures, right? You need capital in order to invest in new technologies. You need capital in order to pay for the development and construction of new factories. You need capital in order to pay those people, like the mill girls, a wage for working your factory, okay? And of course, you're going to need capital in order to purchase or sell, what have you, the commodity that you're purchasing and selling. Thus, we need not just factory system, we need banking. But in addition to that, you're also going to have improved transportation. In order for a market revolution to occur, you have to be able to meet the needs of a consumer outside your locality, right? It's one thing to have a local small business and to meet the needs of, say, like 100 people. But for an industrial revolution to actually occur, you're going to have to broaden your market outside your locale. And the only way that that can work is through the development and improvements of transportation networks. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, right, you have horse, you have foot, you might have some canoe, right? You're going to have very slow moving ways of transportation. Not to mention that it's incredibly expensive because it simply takes a very long time to move goods from one place to the next. If we are going to have a market economy that is going to be revolutionary, there has to be improvements in transportation. And there were at least 2 significant increases in developments of transportation. One was the construction of canals. And for example, the Erie Canal, referred to as the River of Gold, actually revolutionized the way in which commodities could be moved. Okay? It says here in the book, it says the Erie Canal was the longest canal in the world. It virtually revolutionized American economic development. For example, it reduced travel time from New York City to Buffalo from 20 days to 6, and it dropped the cost of moving a ton of freight from $100 to $5. Okay? And the Erie Canal was such a success that it actually spawned a whole host of canal building projects. But the problem is that not every state has a waterway system where canals would work. Okay? And during the winter months, particularly if it gets cold, canals are not helpful because the water freezes over. And so while canals are revolutionary, and the Erie Canal specifically, you're gonna have to have another development, and it is the railroad that will meet that need. Let's move on. It says here that state governments played a key role encouraging both new banking institutions and vastly increased transportation networks. This latter development is often termed the market revolution because of the central importance of creating more efficient ways to transport people, raw materials, and finished goods, as I've already mentioned. Okay? Now, what's the most remarkable invention? In my opinion, it is the railroad. Okay, the railroad could be used year-round, right? And the railroad could go through places that water couldn't go through. Okay, it also created new jobs for people who had to build the railroad. It created new industries such as the steel industry, the lumber industry, right? And of course, the railroads are going to be significant in the development of urbanization because railroads are going to help create cities. Wherever a railroad hub was, there you're going to see more and more people and cities will develop. And so, in fact, these types of technological innovations really will destroy Jefferson's notion of an agricultural republic. And indeed, what we see going on here, the development of a market revolution, is far more in line with what Hamilton had in mind for the country. Okay, so now let's take a look briefly at the railroad. It says here that the development of railroads was one of the most important phenomena of the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, one could argue that the railroads did for the 19th century what, say, the internet is doing for, us today as far as business goes. It changed everything. And let's be honest, particularly as we will see during the American Civil War, it's also going to change the way wars are fought because now you can move people and goods and supply lines much more quickly and efficiently than you could before, changing the outcome and nature of various battles, including, as we will see, the very first battle of the Civil War, First Battle of Bull Run. But not wanting to get ahead of myself, let's just stick to this. It says, with their formation, construction, and operation, they brought profound social, economic, and political change to a country only 50 years old. Now, as I will show you on the next slide, I'm going to show you a map of railroad development between 1850 and 1860. And you're going to see that the Industrial Revolution really brought about a mass amount of railroad building. Railroads were incredibly important. But, and this may not be so obvious, railroads also had the ability to create sectional differences because oftentimes railroads were going to be built in the north in order to support infant American textile factories. And because you had to pay taxes in order to build these railroads, many in the South began to feel alienated as they paid taxes to build railroads that, in many respects, weren't benefiting them because their construction was in the North. Okay? It says here that over the next 50 years, America would come to see magnificent bridges and other structures on which trains would run, awesome depots, ruthless rail magnets, and the majesty of rail locomotives crossing the country. Okay, so let's take a look at this map real quick. Okay, now we can see by 1850, all those lines that you see, those are representative of railroads, okay? And you can see that by 1850, the majority of the railroads are built in the north, okay? Looks like you've got one heading out of Virginia, which connects you not even fully into Baltimore. You'd have to get out and change rails. By 1860, the number of railroads had drastically increased. But one thing I want to point out, because I had mentioned this already, is that if you look at the south, and if you go to where it says New Orleans, and you're going to see a railroad just to the left of it that goes north. It starts in New Orleans and goes north. If you follow that railroad, it will take you from New Orleans to Chicago. That is the only railroad that links the north to the south. Okay, it's the only one. The only other railroad that gets anywhere close is the one where it starts in Memphis and goes east, close to near where Baltimore is, but not quite. Okay, now again, that's important because it demonstrates who is benefiting from these railroads. And indeed, one of the things that's going to damage the South during the Civil War is that it does not have a systematic network of railroads. Okay, but the point of this map is simply to demonstrate, yes, railroads became important, and particularly the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or what became known as the B&O Railroad, which if you've ever played Monopoly, you've probably tried to purchase at one point. So a little fun fact there for you. Let's move on. It says Baltimore, the third largest city in the nation in 1827. Indeed, the top three largest cities in the United States in 1820s were all on the north. It had not invested in a canal, right? New York had invested in a canal, the Erie Canal, but Baltimore had not. And it recognized that if it was going to be competitive within this new market revolution, it was going to have to build something. And so it chose to build a railroad. It says, yet Baltimore was 200 miles closer to the frontier than New York. And this is important because people are moving west, right? And they need commodities. And so soon it recognized that the development of a railway could make the city more competitive with New York and its Erie Canal, right? The result was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the first railroad chartered in the United States. And there, when the thing was built, the first spadeful of earth was actually turned over by the 91-year-old Charles Carroll, who had signed the Declaration of Independence. He was the oldest and last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence in 28 rather. And a little bit symbolic, right? He helped to inaugurate the nation through the Declaration of Independence, and he helped to get it going on its industrial development through pulling over this spadeful of earth. But again, the point here that we're seeing is simply just the need for the United States, and particularly Baltimore, to meet the needs of the American West, its frontier, and just to meet the needs of a general market economy that was growing. So that's an example of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And of course, railroads began to spring up all over the place. All right, let's move on. All right, it states, new railroads came swiftly. In 1830, the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company was formed to draw trade from the interior of the state. It had a steam locomotive built at the West Point Foundry in New York City called the Best Friend of Charleston, which was the first steam locomotive to be built for sale in the United States. A year later, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad reduced a 40-mile wide wandering canal trip that took all day to accomplish to a 17-mile trip that took less than an hour. And again, the point here is simply to demonstrate the significance of the railroad. To read to you from American Narrative History, it says, the railroad gained supremacy over other forms of transportation because of its speed, carrying capacity, and reliability. The early trains averaged 10 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of stagecoaches, and 4 times that of boats. But the railroad boom had negative consequences as well. By opening up possibilities for quick and shady profits, it helped corrupt political life. And indeed, one of the things we are going to find among many of these industrial technologies is that they had both positive consequences and negative consequences. All right, let's move on to the next section. Okay, it says here that the American Industrial Revolution, concentrated in the Northeast, would ultimately prove to be the most significant force in the development of the modern United States. This economic innovation sprung primarily from necessity. New England's agricultural economy was the poorest in the country, and that helped to spur experimentation there. Again, as is true with almost anything that you see, wherever there's an industrial revolution, wherever it's happening, it's because the factors are sufficient for it to happen there. That the industrial revolution doesn't happen in the South, at least not initially, is because the South was content to grow cotton. The South was content to work on a slave-based system. That system didn't work in the North, and so innovation started there. Okay? It says, meanwhile, the far more fertile southern states remained fully committed to agriculture as the central source of its wealth. Here, too, dramatic changes created a wholly new economy that would have been unrecognizable to late 18th century Americans. Now, I want to read to you briefly from a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, written by Edward Baptist. It's a fairly new text. And one of his central arguments is that the slave system of the South was central, in fact, fundamental to the development of American capitalism. He says this, he says, "For a long time I wasn't sure how to tell the story of this muscular, dynamic process in a single book. The most difficult challenge was simply the fact that the expansion of slavery, in many ways, shaped the story of everything in the pre-Civil War U.S. Enslavers' surviving papers showed calculations of returns from slave sales and purchases, as well as the costs of establishing new slave labor camps in the Cotton States. Newspapers dripped with speculations in land and people and the commodities they produced, dramatic changes in how people made money and how much they made, and the dramatic violence that accompanied these practices. The accounts of northern merchants, northern bankers, and northern factory owners showed that they too invested in slavery, bought from and sold to slaveholders, and took slices of profit out of slavery's expansion." What's his point? The Northerners were just as tied up in slavery as the Southerner was. Scholars and students talked about politics as a battle about states as rights or Republican principles, but viewed in a different light, the fights can be seen as a struggle between regions about how the rewards of slavery's expansion would be allocated and whether that expansion could continue. It's an incredibly important point to dress out here because you could easily forget slavery as you look at industrial development. But one of the things I have attempted to try to do here is to make that connection quite clear. That as the North industrializes, specifically the Northeast, and as urbanization is going on, this is connected and linked to the institution of slavery. And it makes the westward expansion of slavery all that more critical. Now, let's take a look at this system real quick in the South. It goes there to say that the slave-based tobacco economy that sustained the Chesapeake region, as you might recall as we spoke about when we were talking about Jamestown, was in deep crisis in the late 18th century, and some Virginia leaders even talked about ending slavery. Slavery was not profitable enough to continue on. But as fate would have it, a technological invention that Eli Whitney came up with, known as the cotton gin, revolutionized this process. It made slavery profitable. Prior to the cotton gin, which the job of the cotton gin was to clean the seeds out of cotton, which was a laborious process that, when done improperly or even efficiently, could damage and tear the cotton. Okay? Prior to the cotton gin, one slave could produce about a pound of cotton a day. With the cotton gin, that one slave could quadruple, if not do more than that, in one day. And so plantation owners begin to produce far more cotton than they've ever done before. They're making far more money than they've ever made before, and they are going to reinvest that cotton in slaves. Now, you definitely need to watch this film. If you click on the word cotton, you're going to get sent to a link of a TED Talk, and it's going to quickly cover the cotton gin for you. You may know what this is, but you need to listen to this discussion on the cotton gin. Okay? So click on that, watch that, and then we'll finish up with the next slide. Okay, as that TED Talk made quite clear, there were both positive and negative consequences of the cotton gin. But what it did was it made cotton king in the South. And it says here that the rise of King Cotton as the defining feature of Southern life revitalized slavery. The promise of cotton profits encouraged The promise of cotton profits encouraged a spectacular rise in the direct importation of African slaves. Now, the transatlantic slave trade, and we've mentioned this once before, the transatlantic slave trade ends in the United States in 1808, and in fact, the TED Talk talked about that. It says here that the promise of cotton profits encouraged a spectacular rise in the direct importation of African slaves in the years before the transatlantic slave trade was made illegal in 1808. 250,000 new slaves arrived in the United States from 1787 to 1808. Now, in 1808, the slave trade is made illegal, but that doesn't necessarily stop the number of slaves growing in the United States. Indeed, slaves were often bred, and masters would give incentives to women to get pregnant and to have more babies. Because in the United States, once a slave, always a slave, and this will be legally codified in the Dred Scott decision. It says, after 1808, the internal slave trade forced African Americans from the border states and the Chesapeake into the new Cotton Belt, which ultimately stretched from upcountry Georgia to eastern Texas. In fact, more than half of the Americans who moved to the Southwest after 1815 were enslaved blacks, thanks to the cotton gin. But that cotton gin, though it had a negative impact in that it made slavery profitable, that cotton gin also helped to make the American economy what it was, because from the backs of slaves came a wealth of cotton that northern bankers, northern shippers, northern textile factories were reliant upon. And so there are positive, negative consequences to this process, but there you have it. Now that's a very rapid overview of the Industrial Revolution. Hopefully you'll be able to find out more information as you read your textbook this week. But that's going to call it for the day. So with that, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, and live long and prosper. Thanks, guys.